Henkels. He's traveled from very, very far away to present to us the bridge between Web 2 and Web 3, which is the importance of legal background of incorporating all these DAOs, and how are you going to touch the real world, the real traditional financial system through this decentralized world that we live in. So a big round of applause. Thank you, Leo, for being here. Very excited to hear your presentation.
Thanks for having me, guys. My name's Leo, as I got wonderfully introduced, and I'm going to be representing MiDAO. MiDAO is the registered agent for DAOs and Web3 projects based in the Marshall Islands. Before I start, who has heard of the Marshall Islands? We have a few people, okay. That's usually the first question I get. And as you can see, it's located right in between Japan and Australia in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Before I kind of dive into what MiDAO does, let me provide a quick history of the company. In 2021, our founders were looking to start a DAO, and they were receiving a lot of interest from the ecosystems. Specifically, the Moonbeam ecosystem offered them a $1 million grant. However, in order to receive this grant, they needed a legal entity. They searched far and wide for different jurisdictions. However, they couldn't find the appropriate one. Some jurisdictions were centralized, others were on blacklists, others actually required high fees. The founders didn't want to incorporate in any of those jurisdictions, so they actually started their own. They started their own legal entity based in the Marshall Islands with best-in-class Web3 regulations. So why did they choose the Marshall Islands? There are several factors, but I think the most important is that it's pro-crypto. 2018, the Marshall Islands launched its own sovereign cryptocurrency. And while it never took off, it established a reputation for being pro-crypto. It's also a historical international registry, particularly in the shipping industry. As you can see here, 13.2 of the world's shipping supply is based in the Marshall Islands. It's a freely associated state with the United States. That means that it gets some benefits of the United States, like using the Postal Service, the Federal Aviation Administration, but it is still a sovereign nation. And that's important because the Marshall Islands has its own corporate law and it's not binding under the US corporate law. But it gets the benefit of getting military protection from the United States. So it's a very stable place to incorporate. The Marshall Islands is compliant, and that was a key selling point for our founders. This is why they ended up choosing the Marshall Islands. It's not on any blacklists. So why do DAOs need entities? I've talked about why we chose the Marshall Islands. I talked about the history, but DAOs need entities for a variety of reasons. I talked about corporate personhood earlier. Corporate personhood basically gives you the ability to enter into contracts, receive grants, hire employees, enter proposals, right? That basically gives you the ability as an entity to interact with the corporate arena. And right now, DAOs can't do that. Furthermore, legal entities, and this is the most important point, legal entities give you limited liability. Right now, DAOs are basically considered a group of people, right? As a group of people right now, we're interacting together under a common purpose, right? And that's considered a general partnership by other jurisdictions and legal entities. That means we could all be held unlimitedly liable if we're entered into a lawsuit. Therefore, we need a legal entity to provide us the veil of limited liability. And there's no better example of this than MiDAO, as you guys can see here. Finally, DAOs incorporate to gain tax clarity. As Meme Brains mentioned, in the new network state, we have tons of, we're living in tons of different jurisdictions and we're spread out across the world. We need an entity to know where to pay our frickin' taxes, right? So what makes MiDAO's entity unique? There's a variety of reasons, but the real core of it comes down to our legislation. In our legislation, we allow membership and governance to be tracked via smart contracts. That means tokens can represent membership interests. It also means that we can do record keeping via smart contracts and governance via smart contracts. This means that the entity actually has limited record keeping and it's easier than traditional entities. So we have these legal entities that still have members that can remain anonymous, and governance is still able to be decentralized since we're tracking with a smart contract and since we're defining tokens via smart contracts. But we're doing this without sacrificing compliancy, and that's a key distinction. Finally, the Marshall Islands is something a lot of other jurisdictions don't, and that's clear securities treatment. I'll talk about that a little bit later. What's the first question you should ask yourself when you enter a DAO? It probably should be, am I going to be sued? If we're all trying to launch a restaurant DAO, this is the question we should be asking ourselves. And so when I was doing some research for this presentation, I came across these things called panacea. I learned that panacea in ancient Greece were used to track governance. There were these little beads, and they would be given out to citizens who had a delegated role in governance. And so let's say we wanted to launch restaurant DAO, and I paid Beeman, for example, to help us build the token, these digital panacea. And let's say I used Tatami to launch these digital panacea. How are we going to track members? And in a DAO, it's very simple. Anyone who owns the token is a member. But in a legal entity, that's not the case. And with MiDAO's legal entity, for the first time ever, anyone who owns the token not only is a member of the DAO, but they're also a member of the legal entity. And therefore, they get that benefit of limited liability. And that's pretty revolutionary. They do this without having to dox themselves, right? So if you're someone who values privacy, you're able to do this. And this goes to what Meme Brains was talking about, right? It's part of the network state. We're able to track members with a digital identity. We've seen Palau do something similar, and we're all working together to create new legislation from traditional jurisdictions with real laws that basically allow for this digital organization. Balaji has come on board as an investor, so we're going to be promoting this network state wherever we go, because we're big believers in it. The next question you should ask yourself once you have your digital panacea token is this thing a security? Is Gary going to come and get my ass? We don't know, but the Marshall Islands will tell you, they won't tell you what exactly a security is, but they will tell you that your governance token is not a security, right? And so they will define the definition of a governance token as not a security. And there's a distinct part of our legislation that says that. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to set a precedent for all other jurisdictions to basically follow this distinction of a governance token. Mostly for US contributors, but for other contributors as well. We crafted this part of our legislation in a meeting room. Jonna was there. And we crafted this with leading Web3 lawyers. They actually workshopped the wording that we should use to make it more compliant for all international jurisdictions. And the reason we did that is because we don't want to be on blacklists. And so one thing we have to do in order to be compliant with these blacklists is do KYC for ultimate beneficial owners. And that means anyone that owns 25% or more of those tokens I mentioned will have to do KYC. And I know that's not ideal for a lot of people who want to preserve privacy, but I just want to remind you that we have to do that to avoid these blacklists. So, who the hell runs these things, right? How are we actually going to do governance? In a DAO, it's clear, right? But when you have a legal wrapper, it's actually not clear to the DAO who runs that legal wrapper. And that's where a lot of the issues we have. When we looked at the legal wrapper landscape, a lot of these legal wrappers require a board of directors, an officer, or a nominee. And that's not decentralized. So what you end up getting is an entity that is centralized with the decentralized DAO that actually uses decentralized governance. And for the first time ever, we've created a legal entity that actually mirrors the decentralized DAO. So now you have a decentralized legal entity with a decentralized DAO. That's pretty revolutionary, right? And you have a bridge to the real world with that legal entity. How do we do this? In the operating agreement of the DAO LLC, which is like the constitution for the DAO LLC, you're able to basically list a smart contract for your governance. So basically it says this DAO is governed by this smart contract on Solana. And that's all you have to do to define governance. And we call these algorithmically managed DAO LLCs. Are these things going to be a lot of work? We actually think that these will be easier than traditional entities. For DAOs, they're designed to be even easier than the current legal wrappers. All you have to do is list your token address or your smart contract address to track members and governance. But not only do we want it to be extremely easy for DAOs, we actually think that our legal entity will be easier for traditional organizations, right? Think about it. If I, as an innovation officer, went to Carl and Frank from Waystar Royco and said, hey, I have this legal entity, I want to start a DAO, and they were looking at the cons, and they saw that it was compliant, they would actually see that it's easier to start a DAO LLC and track members through tokens and governance through a smart contract than it is to start a regular LLC, right? So not only are we trying to appeal to current DAOs, but we're actually trying to onboard traditional organizations to start their own DAO with this legislation and with this legal entity. I know it's crazy, I know it's ambitious, but that's what we hope to do, and that's kind of our VC pitch. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that our legislation is like our product, right? And that's what we're always working on creating and innovating on. So we have this innovative product. I've talked about how tech-friendly it is and how crazy it is. But what can it actually do? And the answer is it's treated just like a regular LLC in the corporate arena. So it can carry out any lawful business. We offer two types of DAO LLCs, a nonprofit and a for-profit DAO LLC. The nonprofit pays 0 in taxes to the Marshall Islands government, while the for-profit pays a 3% gross revenue tax. That's just meant to make it easier for DAOs to report so they don't have to hire an accounting firm. It's just going to be the top line of your revenue. The last question we always get, are DeFi protocols able to incorporate with us? And the answer is yes. We have several DeFi protocols incorporated with us. And we actually got this question so much that we created a blog on our website, and we created this structure that we often see DeFi protocols use. And the reason that I want to highlight this is that in the most recent legislation we passed just about a couple weeks ago, we created a clear separation in our legislation that explicitly defined what an open source protocol was and how a governance DAO could interact with it. And this allows DeFi protocols to incorporate using the structure I just showed on the screen. Here's a really informative visual comparing ourselves to other jurisdictions. Feel free to take a picture, but I'll also describe a lot of the advantages and disadvantages between various jurisdictions in the next slide. So this is kind of the bread and butter of what we do, and this might help put into perspective some of the advantages MiDAO has over other jurisdictions. So DAOs based in the US, the Wyoming DAO LLC, for example, while it was an innovative law, it has a couple issues. They have to deal with being in the US, right? So you have to deal with people like me. No, in seriousness, a DAO based in the US increases its legal nexus with the United States, right? And global organizations typically don't want to do that. Furthermore, the DAO LLC Act in the United States, whether it's through Wyoming, Tennessee, or other jurisdictions, are state laws. So if Gary Gensler comes after you with an SEC DAO regulation, all of these DAO LLC's state laws will be superseded by federal regulation. There are other jurisdictions too, more internationally based ones. The issue with these jurisdictions is that they don't actually have any DAO recognition within their legislation, right? The Marshall Islands legislation is called the DAO Act of 2022, and then the DAO Act of 2023, the amendment. So we have two acts that explicitly recognize DAO in their title, not to mention the tons of times we mentioned blockchain, tokens, smart contracts within the actual legislation. So we have DAO recognition in the Marshall Islands. And then furthermore, like I mentioned, we're able to define governance and membership with tokens and smart contracts, right? So we have a decentralized entity, whereas some of these jurisdictions I've shown here require boards and officers with your legal entity, creating that veil of centralization. And finally, all these places are going to cost a lot more than what the Marshall Islands does if you're worried about price. So lastly, feel free to check out some of the resources. Visit our website. We have a guide to DAO incorporation, which will help walk you through some legal entity options. It's a great way to determine whether you actually need a legal entity for your DAO. I'm not going to sit here and say that every DAO needs a legal entity. Some don't, but I think a lot do, and I think that guide would be a really good resource for you guys. Finally, get in touch with me. I'm at Leo Henkels on all platforms, and feel free to reach out to me in the conference or shoot me an email. It was a pleasure speaking to you guys. Thanks to the AthensDAO team for having me.
Thank you so much, Leo. Thank you so much. It's important. It's the classic problem we all have in this space, where you hire a